English translation, 625th Contact, Part 3, Saturday, the 15th of August, 2015, 1744 hours.
Then we have discussed everything regarding all the articles, so we can turn to other things, such as when the Swiss National Bank will actually start issuing new banknotes. You promised me last year that you would look into this matter. For years it was said again and again that the new banknotes would be issued in Switzerland after all, but each time everything was thrown out. So far nothing has gone, because nothing has happened so far for this year 2015 either, although it was said that new banknotes would be put into circulation in the course of the summer or after.
Unfortunately, I neglected to tell you that I had clarified the matter. A date has now been set for late spring next year, that is to say 2016. I have also promised you that by the middle of this year, I will tell you the result of our clarification regarding the effective use of by the middle of this year. Due to my absence, I am somewhat late with my clarification of the result, but this has shown that during the last 5 years of observation of the clarification, an effective value of a daily average work performance of 4.08 hours has resulted, converted according to the actual daily work performance of a normal, strong, earthly man who works 8.5 hours per day.
Just this week there was talk about this, although not this figure, but some things were mentioned in this regard. Consequently, the statement was only slightly off the mark. But something else. The Islamistische Staat continues to commit ongoing machinations which are felonious and very badly out of the control of the good human nature, against which the Iraqi and Syrian military as well as the British and U.S. American aircraft squadrons, which are deployed against the IS, do much too little and not the right thing to exterminate the Islamisten Staat. On one hand, many military people and pilots probably enjoy being able to make war, whereby probably love of adventure or a joy of killing and destroying play a decisive role. On the other hand, with the entire matter of the lax actions against the IS, the participating country's profit-making plays an extremely important role. This is namely in that form because through the lax and almost useless munitions-wasting battles and machinations of the regular military, as well as of the foreign air forces, who hurl masses of rockets and bombs, the weapon industry, which delivers all the munitions for the fruitless actions against the IS, is kept alive, whereby naturally also the countries themselves profit to a great extent. This is so because they collect immense taxes from the manufacturers of fighter aircraft, weapons, munitions, rockets, and bombs. Aside from that, the foreigners, especially the USA, can implant themselves into Iraq, into Syria, into Afghanistan, and recently also into Turkey, and claim that they are providing assistance against the Islamisten Staat. In this form they spread out in the countries concerned, as in the first position the USA has always done already for ages all over the world and also will continue to do, whereby it can indulge in its world control imperialism, that is to say, it can increasingly expand its endeavoring and its political, military, and economic areas of might and influence. And, as said, the USA stands ahead of all in regard to this, in conscienceless, criminal form which disdains human life and disregards every right and indeed in felonious form. And it mendaciously and deceitfully acts as world police and the selfless saver of freedom and of the world, and thereby also does not shy away from underhandedly provoking wars as it has done worldwide for ages. So indeed also in Vietnam, out of which decade-long killing, murder, raping, torture, destruction, and elimination, as well as unspeakably great need, misery, pain, and sorrow came forth. At that time, namely, it was on the 4th of August 1964, as I know from your daughter Sim Ya-se, as well as from you and Quetzal, and about which I also have read something, the U.S. American Secret Service. NSA National Security Agency searched for a felonious way to provoke a war against the communist North Vietnam, although North Vietnam in no form had given a reason for war actions. Therefore, in the South China Sea, on the destroyer, USS Maddox, the NSA manufactured a faulty sonar echo, that is to say, a false sonar echo, in order to let the NSA agents officially act and indeed in the form that they consciously falsely and mendaciously presented the harmless and false sonar echo. created by them as a torpedo attack of the Viet Cong. All falsified information, reports and coordinates which arose from that, which were consciously manufactured through lies and deception, proceeded immediately through the news filter of the Secret Service, NSA, which also manipulated and falsified all radio signals, photos and sea maps, and indeed besides which, on the destroyer USS Maddox, they induced an intentionally false and therefore alleged and effectively invented major combat and torpedo alarm. As a consequence, naturally the warship changed its course, whereby with the heavy twin turrets of the destroyer, it opened fire for several hours on the imaginary and non-existent enemy, and there was wild shooting across the ocean. In addition to this, on the same day retaliation attacks on the city of Hanoi were carried out by the U.S. aircraft carrier, USS Ticonderoga, with fighter aircraft. Naturally, no Viet Cong ships, submarines, or torpedoes were encountered at sea, because neither were there any in the area of the destroyer, nor was North Vietnam taking part in the entire thing at all. The fact is that a perfect theatrical performance was launched by the NSA which served to make it possible for the USA to involve Viet Cong in a war, in the hope that North Vietnam could be annexed into the area of USA world control by the USA Armed Forces. But that was a complete flop, because North Vietnam did not let itself be brought into line. Rather, it humiliated the USA, the strongest army of the world at that time, and gave its armed forces one hammering after another during the 10-year war, and finally a complete moral and military defeat in a lost war. According to your earlier explanations, unfortunately this Vietnam War cost more than 6.5 million human lives, whereby, however, it is today claimed that it had only been 5 million human lives. Fundamentally also still to be said is that the armed forces in general, therefore those of all countries, are trained to boundlessly and consciencelessly kill and murder, whereby also monstrous war crimes of many forms are committed, and also women and children are sexually abused, raped, and, along with many non-participating human beings from among the people, are tortured, mistreated, and murdered. But if now everything is considered further than just in regard to the mentioned human-disdaining and rights-disregarding machinations of the USA, then the US-American human beings step into the focus of examination. It thereby becomes clearly apparent that a great part of the USA population suffers from an irreversible psychosis. With a number for the entire population of around 320 million human beings, the great mass of paranoid ones amounts to a large part of the population which lives in a psycho-persecution delusion. In this great number of paranoid ones, there are naturally not only simple citizens to mention, rather especially also many politicians, members of the police force, Secret Service people, economic heads, military personnel, political party members, religionists and sectarians, as well as hate and terrorist groups and so forth. It's all characteristic of them, therefore not only those running amok, who are constantly growing in number in the USA, that they believe themselves to be threatened, persecuted and betrayed, and have irreversibly fallen into a morbid paranoia, out of which they live in the delusion that they have to eradicate, drive out, and kill all those human beings who fit into their racist image of the enemy, especially all the psychotically ill ones. Therefore, the paranoiacs who are naturally more or less psychopathically disposed have cowardly anxiety that they, as white U.S. citizens, would be killed by human beings of other colors and other races as well as other beliefs. Thereby, quite especially, the black human beings are at the forefront as the image of the enemy, which is born of the racial delusion of the white, psychoses-afflicted U.S. Americans, and are accused of wanting to kill and murder the white human beings in order to finally take control of the white race in the USA. And, with those with the paranoid personality disorder, this cowardly anxiety and the therewith connected delusion of being murdered, as a white female or male, by a black human being, is completely irrational in the face of the effective facts and truth, which verifiably shows that the probability of being killed by a white human being is 6 times higher than being killed by a black human being. The truth is that only 14% of all white victims of murder are killed by blacks, while, in contrast to that, 84% of the murders of whites are also to be attributed to white U.S. Americans. And to be said with the entire matter in regard to the spreading paranoia in a great part of the U.S. population is that also the federal institutions are befallen by that, whereby in this regard especially the police are at the forefront because it is a verifiable probability that an Afro-American is 7 times more likely to be shot by security forces than a white human being is. The entire thing is a consequence of the pathological delusion of persecution and of the irrational conspiracy theories as well as of the paranoid modes of behavior of all race haters in regard to a noteworthy part of the U.S. population. Whereby the fact also is that in this regard there is nowhere else in the world where the same or even only similar circumstances prevail as prevail in U.S. America. The cowardly anxiety of the white ones, indeed of the white U.S. Americans, that the Afro-Americans or other non-white ones in America could take control of the USA and its population, is widespread. But, in this regard, it is not only the black human beings who dominate the paranoid psychopathic body of thoughts of the U.S. American racists, because truthfully it is also the religions, in which they see great dangers, whereby especially the male and female Muslims, as well as the male and female Jews, embody the racist image of the enemy because they are supposed to be a threat for the entire country, the religious and sectarian Christian faith, and for the economy. And concerning this, especially paranoid psychopathic ultra-right-wing Republicans and so-called liberal peace apostles are the greatest screamers, stink-makers and agitators of the people, whereby the Tea Party is certainly at the forefront in this regard and sees a potential terrorist in every believer of Islam and Jewish human being. It is thereby overlooked that alone in America, since the 11th of September 2001, when the World Trade Center was destroyed by Islamistic al-Qaeda terrorists, more terror attacks have been committed by white racists, and twice as many human beings have been killed, than by radical Islamistan and Jews in the USA. And if the racism of the U.S. Americans is examined further, then also the radical right-wing scene comes into the focus of consideration, whereby it becomes visible that the neo-Nazis in the USA are well and truly on the hunt to persecute, harm, and even to murder Afro-Americans, Jews, Muslims, Mexicans, and all others who do not belong to the white U.S. American population. Belonging to these race haters are also the People's Front, Aryan Nations 88, and Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and so forth, whereby solely in the Midwest of the USA more than 30 Nazi organizations exist and carry out their evil racial mischief and commit ever more Gewalt. And that all of that can happen is based on a further reason, being that, as a result of unemployment and the climbing poverty, a fertile ground is created for further anxiety and paranoia, which the Nazis and other racists use to win insecure human beings for the racist terror with racist lies and calumnies, whereby especially young ones are radicalized for that. But it is not only the Nazi organizations and the Ku Klux Klan as well as other known racist groups which promote the racism in the USA, because, as unbelievable as it sounds, it is effectively also security groups and security organizations, such as the FBI U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is the greatest trainer of terrorists in the USA, and the CIA Central Intelligence Agency =Overseas Secret Service of the United States, which stirs up the paranoia in the population everywhere. This is done by persuading human beings, who are weak in consciousness or are somehow willing to carry out attacks and acts of terror, after which the perpetrators are, as in a stage play, hunted down and imprisoned, presented to the population through the media, and then convicted. So it is a fact that since the 11th of September 2001, of the altogether 175 failed terror attacks in the USA to the year 2015, only just 6 assassination attempts did not lead back to the federal authorities. The truth also is that, in the USA, since the 11th of September 2001, up to the year 2015, far more than 5,000 female and male human beings were shot by whites, and in the same time frame, 26 by radical Islamistan. Further to be said in regard to the U.S. American weapons delusion is that during the last 14 years, in the USA, 30,000 children were killed through the misuse of firearms as well as, again, since 2001 to 2015, 5,000 human beings died as a result of handling their own firearms and the accidental triggering of a shot. And if the truth is seen like that, then it is to be recognized that through such occurrences in the USA, very many more victims of death are to bemoan than through an Islamistish, Jewish or other terror attack from non-white human beings, according to the US-American racial delusion. But that does not stop the world's mightiest American weapons lobby, NRA National Rifle Association, from continuing to constantly nationally advance its insanity of the arming of the population, and thereby disregarding the effective facts of the misuse of weapons. The weapons lobby, in which also the entire weapons industry is integrated, does not want to see the truth and also does not concern itself that annually there are thousands of dead to mourn due to weapons, because their interest lies only in financially profiting tremendously, for which reason they also consciously promote the anxiety and the paranoid personality disorders in the population. However, that thereby more and more running amok, murder and terror acts come about does not concern them in any form. On the contrary, they use all this very badly, getting out of control of the good human nature to their benefit, because the more that happens in this form, the more they can control the population, and namely because, with the running amok, murders and terror acts, and the weapons used for that, they have a mighty means of irrational anxiety through which they can dominate and control the human beings. And exactly that is done by the weapons lobby, the weapons industry, the secret services, economic bosses and other ruling ones, and indeed right up into the official agencies and the government. Therefore, with the USA, a paranoid psychopathic nation must be spoken of, at least in regard to the psychotic part of the entire population. Were that not the case, how could it otherwise be that there is practically always shooting first and only then questions, as the facts prove? To shoot first and then ask questions is effectively an unwritten and somehow holy rule in the USA, which also proves itself in the police handling of weapons and shooting. Because alone in the months of January to May of the year 2015, 385 human beings were shot by police, whereby legalized murder is more likely the right label. And when one thinks of the racism, which is also carried out blatantly by the police, then it is not surprising that, as a rule, 4 times as many black human beings are shot than is the case on the other hand in regard to white human beings. If the situation is exactly considered, then, on one hand, cowardly anxiety is the reason for the trigger-happy police. However, on the other hand, being able to exercise their might behavior over other human beings as well as wanting to kill. And indeed especially in regard to the non-whites or those of other faiths, who do not fit into their white racial schema. And concerning this, if the entire matter is viewed and considered for the future, then the number of civil victims of the conscienceless, cowardly anxiety and the police, who are messing their trousers, will keep on increasing very drastically. And this will happen because the mass of the overpopulation incessantly continues to increase, whereby ever more conflicts of all kind arise, which, especially in the USA, are confronted by anxious, cowardly, and trigger-happy police who simply consciencelessly shoot and murder the fallible, those who appear to be fallible and therefore innocent ones. And this happens with federal protection because already since time immemorial and in the future, more and more the U.S. government continues to increasingly more massively build up the weaponization and the powers of the police, while the population has nothing or hardly anything to say about that. At the present time in the USA there are over 800,000 police, whereby a certain number of them effectively are to be labeled killers in uniform and go unpunished after every murder, freely according to the rule that, as police, they have the federally assured right to shoot a human being when they feel threatened, or there are other special circumstances of danger. And the whammy with this rule is that a victim does not even have to carry a weapon or attack a police officer in order to be shot by one, because for that it is definitely enough when a human being speaks or moves clumsily, or when a police officer feels threatened, which very often is completely baseless, as such cases prove again and again. Nevertheless, the racial hatred in the USA spreads further through white USA citizens and continuously and increasingly promotes the gay vault against the Afro-Americans and all others, who do not fit into the white racial schema of the race haters. This US-American racial hatred, and the quite cowardly anxiety about the Afro-Americans, and above all, about other human beings of diverse countries and religions and so forth, corresponds to a pathological, malicious, paranoid psychopathic personality disorder, which spreads across the entire nation of USA and by which a large part of the US population is befallen. All of the related cowardly anxiety, the racial hatred and the persecution delusion which is integrated into that, as you once said, is, on one hand, probably based effectively in a genetically inherited memory from the time when the US-American world was confronted with the slavery and the therewith connected horror and murders of the slaves, which were committed by the Ku Klux Klan and other race haters. On the other hand, as you have also explained, the cowardly anxiety and the persecution delusion has been based, since time immemorial, in a genetic memory in regard to the source and the cause of the origin of the white first population of the current U.S. America. Indeed, the fact is that the majority of the current U.S. citizens are distant descendants of the early white American, immigrants who immigrated to the promised land of that time only because they had to flee from Europe because they were hated, persecuted, and had their lives threatened as a consequence of their diverse religious sectarianism or their criminal lives. That created in them a hatred against all who were not like them, which, in expanded form, expressed itself as a peculiar racial hatred. Indeed, in regard to all those who had not fallen into a sectism, to which not only the simple citizens belonged, rather also the officials and governors. The entire thing is therefore based on a fact which genetically established itself in the sect-believing refugees and over many generations has been preserved deep in the DNA until today. Consequently, a great part of the U.S. population is the worst worldwide in regard to the cowardly anxiety of being a victim of a black or other non-white human being. The thoughts and the therefrom arising feelings of the race haters are characterized by being secure with their own body and life only with a weapon and its use against fellow human beings. So that is that, whereby I want to say in addition to that also in regard to it an effective order will have to be created, whereby in particular the racist groups and racist organizations of all kinds, therefore also all Nazi and other groups set up on racial extremism in the USA, must be targeted and stamped out, and indeed through a multinational strike force for peace, in accord with the schema of Nokodemian Henok. In addition to that, I still want to say that all that I have mentioned are indisputable facts, which quite especially strongly demand that finally a worldwide multinational strike force for peace has to be created, which is trained in creating order, peace and freedom in a form worthy of the human being, through Gewalt sama Gewalt los Ichkeit, and indeed also in the respect that all hatred of foreigners, faiths, religions, and races is completely stopped, whereby in this regard in the civilized world, the USA is in the first position to be combated. With U.S. America it is certainly questionable, when all of the racial hatred, the death penalty, the unfair exercising of punishment and administration of justice, and so forth, is viewed and considered, whether this nation can be spoken of as civilized. Now, in regard to the application of a multinational strike force for peace, this must exist and act according to Gewalt sama Gewalt los Ichkeit, and without any badly getting out of control of the good human nature, indeed counter to all the very badly getting out of control of the good human nature that always came about, since ancient times on the earth with all armies and wars, and which also occurs in the current time in ever worse form. Therefore, it means that in the battle there may only be killing in a last-minute emergency when there is no other possibility for the protection of the lives of the fighters of the multinational strike force for peace, or the innocent. The fundamental form of fighting, and the actual fighting procedure of the troops concerning this, is based, as I know from the Nokodemian Henok storage bank data, in the opponent, or opponents, being surrounded with a considerable superior number, and then, by means of all kinds of anesthetizing weapons, such as anesthetizing gas and other anesthetizing substances, as well as beam and shock weapons and so forth, being made harmless and taken prisoner. After that, the prisoners are interned in secure camps and so forth, as well as banished in certain cases. Therefore, it is the case that a multinational strike force for peace fulfills its duties of Gewaltsamen Gewalt los Ichkeit in the face of wars, terrorism and atrocities and so forth, and thereby protects the humanity in every regard, and therefore neither tortures, murders, kills, nor rapes, and so forth. As I know in this regard from the storage banks, the multinational strike forces for peace of Nokodemion and Henuk were therefore deployed in such a form that they firstly advanced with a great superiority of numbers and surrounded the opponents, and secondly, they were not set up for killing and murder, rather only, with appropriate means and weapons, for making the opponent incapable of fighting. They thereby implemented the Gewalt sama Gewalt Losik Kite. They had at their disposal diverse appropriate beam weapons as well as gases and other means with which they anesthetized the opponents and made them incapable of fighting, took them prisoner and finally, under certain circumstances, if it was necessary, banished them or interned them in camps. But the majority of those who were suitable for freedom and were no further danger in regard to terror acts or acts of war could return to their everyday lives and to their families after some considerable time. The same principle would also be possible with us on the earth instead of killing and murdering, because also here on this world there exist gases and other substances which a multinational strike force for peace could use in order to stop opponents, make them incapable of fighting in order to then intern them in camps, banish them, to ship them to deportation locations, or to let them go back to their everyday lives again and to their families, if they integrated themselves into peace and humaneness. But the Earthlings prefer to kill, murder, torture, and rape on one hand, and on the other hand, they are so greedy for profit that they much prefer to make war booty through theft and robbery as well as maintaining munitions and weapons factories, and so forth, through which they earn billions by deploying everything altogether for murderous wars and terrorism, whereby uncountable human beings die, are wounded, or become cripples. Monstrous destructions come about, and also a tremendous amount of nature and its fauna and flora is destroyed.
Whereby you are right. Actually, with all forms of technology available on the Earth today and with all the knowledge, it would be possible to form a multinational strike force for peace, which would be equipped with all of the necessary means named by you. Consequently, with the use of Gewalt sama Gewalt Los Ich Kite, no murder and killing would occur anymore. Effectively, through suitable means and substances, opponents or fallible ones and so forth would only be made incapable of fighting by means of anesthesia, in order to then intern them in suitable camps, keep them far from the society and secured places, or to banish them.
Thereby also serious felonies of individuals or groups against fellow human beings could be avoided just as much as torture, wars, and all kinds of things which are very badly getting out of the control of the good human nature which go along with that, such as through the secret services and military of the USA, to which also destruction, murderous religious and other sectarianism and terrorism belong, as is the case, for example, in regard to Islamistischer Staat and its ever-spreading offshoots, as well as the Taliban, and so forth. And to be said in regard to IS is that the media, journalists, politicians, and the world have still not comprehended and not understood that the IS is no Islamischer Staat. Rather, it is a criminal militia which names itself Islamistischer Staat, and that therefore the IS members are Islamisten, testifies to sheer stupidity, idiocy, unlogic, and unintellect. The effective rightness and truth is namely that the real male and female Muslims are principally to be called Islamglaubige or Islamiten. Consequently, there exists just as serious a difference between an Islamisten and an Islamiten as between Islamischer Staat and Islamistischer Staat. But unfortunately also the language experts, linguists, dictionary publishers and newspaper writers and so forth are not as educated and do not have such a good grasp in regard to the German language as the Plejaren learned ones concerning this. Consequently, they also do not think logically and can neither recognize the striking difference of these terms, nor can they convey and introduce them into the corresponding dictionaries and lexica, and so forth.
Which actually is the case. Through a multinational strike force for peace, also the USA would be stopped in its greed to be world police and in its abnormal might form. Consequently, it could no longer act in its warmongering, annexing, and criminal secret service and belligerent form.
Which would also mean that the interference of the USA in the EU dictatorship and in its idiotic dictatorship, politics would come to an end, and thereby also the agitating against Russia, which is quite especially being driven in the EU by the German Chancellor Angela Merkel in cooperation with US America. The EU dictatorship-led politics fires up the far-reaching conflict with Russia ever further, which can still lead to very grave consequences if the EU dictatorship and, above all, Angela Merkel does not finally change course, and instead of going towards bad confrontations with Russia, switch to a peaceful coexistence. If that does not happen, then ultimately the entirety of Europe, and thereby also Switzerland, will suffer, but also Russia and its member countries as well as the whole world.
That is certainly not to be doubted. If the EU carries on further in the same fire-stoking framework, which is driven on by this Angela Merkel, who, in the EU, is the decisive fundamental power of all dictatorial affectations. Dictatorship endeavors, ambitions for might, incorporations of countries into the EU, and, regarding this, engrossments and wrong measures.
Whereby it is not noticed and not understood by the masters of creation who are at the EU helm, in their stupidity and idiocy, that they are manipulated by the reality-estranged naive chancellor, just as they are deceived by the US politicians and are used through and through for their secret and time-honored plans in regard to world control, which naturally also involves the striving toward interference in the EU dictatorship. And that is actually so because she is effectively the decisive head person for the USA, in order to put their secret and underhanded efforts of being able to interfere in the EU dictatorship into reality, and indeed in such a way that Angela Merkel works in the form of the US-American insinuations and accordingly works politically, manipulatively in the EU dictatorship. That is the reason why she is sought out and preferred by the US politicians, and she does not notice, in her reality-estranged naivety, that she is underhandedly and unhonestly used, seduced, and has her mind poisoned for the US plans. Consequently, she acts according to the US insinuations which are established in her, by indoctrinating the EU mighty ones in the cunning form desired by the USA, and thereby prepares the way for a comprehensive influence of the USA in the EU dictatorship. All those who belong to the same ranks of the EU dictatorial ones are so much in bondage to the federal chancellor, who has fallen into the reality-estranged naivety, that they do not notice how this woman has them all wrapped around her finger according to the US plans, and that they are so indirectly manipulated by the USA. Therefore, the whole thing means that, in accord with the reality-estranged naive actions and works of Angela Merkel, and in line with the US-American fine details, all EU satellites are deceitfully trained for the USA playing a part in the EU dictatorship. But stupidity and idiocy just know no limits, as is the case with the federal chancellor, and indeed especially because she has a reality-estranged naivety, and thereby also one of the innumerable forms of a personality disorder, which is also connected with psychopathic forms and which leads to a might delusion. Also to say about that is that the reality-estranged naivety has nothing to do with the actual naivety. That is to say, the natural naivety, which is characteristic of many human beings and is innate at birth and is therefore to be called natural. The natural naivety, which is also called blue-eyedness and primal and harmlessly childish, can, in a shortened form which has merged into the general language usage, be regarded as naturalness, whereby, arising from that, human beings who are not able to appropriately evaluate verbal remarks, circumstances, actions, and situations, and so forth, are generally called naive, for which reason the naivety in this form is also a synonym for gullible, innocent, easily deceivable, or unknowledgeable. However, this natural form of naivety has in no form something to do with the reality-estranged naivety, which appears in pathologically half-witted, primal and foolish form and is based on pathological delusions as a consequence of wrong assessments, of which the befallen human being is not conscious, and which also cannot be recognized by the fellow human beings, and, as a rule, by experts. The delusion is based in reality-estranged, naive, wrong estimations, wrong assessments, and wrong interpretations in regard to expositions, presentations, things, decisions, clarifications, events, situations, occurrences, speech, facts, and matters, as well as in lacking knowledge of human nature, and so forth. Furthermore, also connected with that are personal, wrong forms of viewing and considering, delusional believing, guilefulness, egoism, self-deceit, self-enticement, estrangement from reality, and lack of recognition of reality. From that there arise wrong viewpoints and forms of understanding, and indeed because the reality of a matter, and so forth, is not comprehended, not recognized, and consequently also not appraised in a real correct form, and therefore can neither be assessed nor realistically evaluated. That leads to the effectively existing facts and actuality being completely wrongly interpreted, and, consequently, from that, wrong and dangerous decisions being made, and naturally also correspondingly erroneous and confused actions being carried out, through which much terribleness is caused in many kinds of forms. And this is especially the case with reality-estranged naive human beings, in regard to verbal utterances, presentations, explanations, as well as the modes of behavior and conduct of other human beings who get into the focus of one who is pathologically naive due to estrangement from reality, whereby it plays no role whether the entirety of the matter which gets into the attentiveness of the reality-estranged naive one relates to something familial, societal, philosophical, political, private, religious, sectarian, or purely worldly. Thereby, concerning this, everything is connected with anxieties about failure and persecution delusion, which are suppressed outwardly for the fellow human beings to the point of not being detectable, but which are masked by an especially pathologically hoggish commitment to a matter as well as through an extremely shrewd and indeed intelligent, suggestive dictatorial might demeanor as well as perfect play acting and a false competence demeanor. The entire thing works in this form on the fellow human beings such that a reality-estranged naive one who acts in this form is wrongly appraised as being a very considerate, decisive human being who is sure in actions and is competent, and is therefore praised excessively. As your father Svath already taught me, and as you taught me on various occasions and explained to me during the course of our friendship, the actual reality-estranged naivety is to be labeled against intellect and rationality, literally also insane, or also megalomaniacal. The whole thing is based pathologically on a serious inferiority complex and a psychical disorder which is transformed through self-deceit into megalomania and imperiousness, and is outwardly play-acted as comprehensive competence, and is consequently not recognized by the fellow human beings and even by experts. In its center, this form of the reality-estranged naivety is based on dominating delusions, which call forth anxieties of failure, anxieties of persecution, or, in the worst case, an acute persecution delusion, as well as a distorted perception of the effective, real reality and its truth. As a rule, human beings who are reality-estranged naive fall into the same category as natural naive ones and suffer from the same symptoms as them, however, are able to cover their reality-estranged naivety and therewith their personality disorder so perfectly that, as I said, it cannot even be detected by experts, not to mention by lay people who are untrained concerning this. A reality-estranged naive human being sees in his or her environment as well as, by and large, in descriptions, presentations, things, explanations, facts, events, speech, situations, and occurrences, and in any human beings, a hostile, and in extreme cases, even malicious persecutory attitude towards him or her, when all of it does not correspond to his or her own view and opinion, and everything does not fit into his or her personal field of viewing and considering, understanding, rationality, and desire, nor into his or her endeavors and into his or her objectives. This is so, while, in regard to the same factors, a human being in his or her reality-estranged naivety just takes everything at face value, and accordingly also unconcernedly and inconsiderately acts in the form suggested to him or her, when he or she is led to believe that someone is of the same view and opinion, and of the same mind as him or her. Fundamentally, in his or her delusion, a reality-estranged naive human being sees everything in an effectively reality-estranged form, and according to his or her own views and his or her personal opinion. Consequently, he or she assesses circumstances in a way that is confusingly wrong, and even also condemns them. But that leads to completely wrong and confused views and a basically wrong opinion arising in him or her, which he or she suggestively conveys to fellow human beings, influences them according to his or her sense, and brings them to his or her reality, estranged, naive, confused line, and turns them into blind followers, without them perceiving that they are put under pressure and are led into the unreal. The reality estranged, naive human being, like the actual, natural, naive one, is controlled by an anxious or aggressive mistrust in regard to other human beings, whereby the whole thing leads delusionally to the conviction that any human being who gets into his or her focus would plot against him or her. But, paradoxically, that does not prevent the reality-estranged naive one from being like naturally naive human beings, namely innocent, childish, gullible, unknowing, easily deceived and simple-minded and foolish indeed beyond the normal naive one. Consequently, he or she cannot evaluate the events, actions, situations, circumstances and descriptions, things, insinuations, facts, lies, speech, guidelines and calumnies and so forth, which are suggestively introduced to him or her in any appropriate form. This is a fact that means that, also through the deceitfulness and other machinations of any human being, the reality-estranged naive human being can, in this form, be extremely strongly negatively influenced and manipulated in a form which is not consciously perceptible for him or her. But it also means that a human being, who is naive in a reality-estranged form, in many regards is not able to recognize and understand, in a reality-based form, that which is effective and real as well as views, statements, descriptions, things, events, opinions and circumstances and so forth, rather wrongly interprets everything in a reality-estranged naive way, and therefore interprets the opposite to that which is basically given or meant. Therefore, through the reality-estranged naivety, there arises, from the human being befallen by it, a form of viewing and considering in regard to something, from which there comes forth a wrong interpretation of the situation, and accordingly also a completely wrong appraisal opposite to the matter, as well as a wrong action and behavior. And exactly that is the case in regard to the Federal Chancellor Merkel, who, in her reality-estranged naivety, does not recognize the suggestive influences, which are directed at her of the USA's federally responsible politicians, and consequently is not able to recognize nor assess the effective scope of these U.S. influences. Thereby she is an unknowing and willing plaything of the U.S. politics and, according to its sense, in the EU dictatorially directs the line and the mode of behavior of all the EU politicians, however, completely unnoticed by the stupid, idiotic, mighty ones of the EU dictatorship. And this is because they do not know the true face of the Chancellor, any more than they do the effective backgrounds which are given through the suggestive influencing by the U.S. politicians, whereby the whole matter of the USA playing a part in the EU dictatorship is at the forefront, but also U.S. America's world control desires as well as a free trade agreement between the USA and the EU dictatorship. And when the spectrum of the reality-estranged naivety of which I talk is viewed and considered, then under certain circumstances, as with the actual reality-estranged human being, this reaches from neurotic inclinations to serious psychotic characteristics. However, which are so suppressed and veiled by the reality-estranged naive one that the whole thing cannot be perceived by the fellow human beings and even by trained experts. But, under certain circumstances, precisely that is extremely dangerous for the environment, and indeed especially in regard to politics. Especially in the present connection which concerns the machinations of the EU dictatorship against Russia. As with an essentially neurotic human being, a reality-estranged naive one is characterized just as much by an exaggerated sensitivity regarding rejections, being easily aggrieved and mistrust, which leads to him or her mightfully putting himself or herself in the foreground with gavolt, lies and deceit, bootlicking and with all other conceivable means, and indeed even when he or she has to stop at nothing. In this form, the reality-estranged human being who is befallen by delusion, and indeed, in this form, having a personality disorder, believes that even neutral or friendly actions of other human beings are hostilely or disdainfully directed against him or her. In this form, constantly recurring and unjustified accusations are delusionally raised by this kind of naive human being against all those fellow human beings, who, as I already said, do not share his or her view and opinion, and do not fit into his or her schema of intellect and rationality. and also not into his or her objectives, which he or she extremely suggestively, jealously, dictatorially conveys to others, and where necessary, also cantankerously fights for. Perhaps you can just explain what is to be understood by reality-estranged naivety. Perhaps in the form as Svath explained it to me, and as you also precisely explained to me, and as I now have attempted to recall the whole thing to some extent. You, as a skilled expert, can do that certainly better than I can. To my knowledge, the term reality-estranged naivety is not known in the teaching of terrestrial medicine, as well as psychology and psychiatry and so forth, for which reason I think that a short explanation from you would certainly be good.
That which you have presented from my father's teaching and explanations and from mine is absolutely applicable and so detailed that actually everything necessary has thereby been said. But I will nonetheless happily still contribute something short about that. Fundamentally, like paranoia, reality-estranged naivety is characterized by a particular sensitivity regarding rejections, bearing grudges, being easily aggrieved, exaggerated mistrust, and so forth, whereby still to add to that is an inclination to interpret that which is experienced in the direction of tendencies which are hostile towards oneself. The reality-estranged naive human being rebels, through a deep-reaching might demeanor, and through all kinds of similarly directed modes of behavior, and often also through revenge machinations, against everything which does not correspond to his or her view and opinion construct, whereby, in this form, he or she exerts might over fellow human beings, which happens in extremely insidious form and is not realized by those human beings who are involved in it. A further thing to say regarding that is that a reality-estranged naive human being, just like a paranoiac, defines neutral and friendly actions of others as hostile, pejorative, or disparaging, whereby in this way these impulsations are also experienced by him or her in a thought-feeling-based form. Thereby, also a delusional jealousy emerges which is directed against the views, the opinions, and might of others, who are deemed to be adversaries if they do not conform to his or her own reality, estranged, naive modes of behavior. As a rule, the whole matter of the reality-estranged naivety also leads to unjustified suspicions in regard to an incapability of those fellow human beings who are viewed and considered to be stupid, and, in regard to intellect, rationality, and the ability to make decisions, as well as the ability to act, are viewed and considered to be without intellect and without rationality, and consequently, in line with the delusion of the reality-estranged naive human being must be dictatorially taught, correctly led, and guided through his or her intellect and rationality. That is the actual might behavior of the reality-estranged naive human being, who is additionally also stubborn and quarrelsome and brings this to the fore in such form that the fellow human beings, who are directed and suggestively dictatorially led by him or her, do not perceive that they are steered selfishly and imperiously through the machinations of the reality-estranged naive one. Human beings with a reality-estranged naive personality disorder are controlled by a false and inflated self-worth delusion, and by a greatly exaggerated self-centeredness delusion, as well as by an insatiable egoism and by an insistence on being right, whereby, under certain circumstances, the reality-estranged naive state can also be associated with a paranoid schizophrenia and an actual paranoia. Basically, in every case, a reality-estranged naivety concerns a psychical disorder, in which significantly also psychopathic influences are present. Consequently, therefore, a reality-estranged naive human being is without doubt, in a certain way, also a psychopath. This is a fact which, naturally, as a consequence of the perfect acting skill, the psychopath knows how to conceal outwardly so much that, as a rule, at least lay people, as well as very often also experts, are not able to perceive and therefore also not recognize, not define, and not understand his or her personality disordered disposition. Consequently, also, the might-filled decisions, Actions and modes of behavior of a reality-estranged naive human being are not recognized, which leads to the reality-estranged naive one who, as a consequence of his or her psychopathy, has a pronounced acting capability at his or her disposal, being able to transfix the fellow human beings, deceive them and win their unjustified trust, which often leads to quarrel and strife as well as to far-reaching unpeace among the human beings with whom they interact. And wars frequently arise, and acts of revenge and retribution as well as hate and destruction, if reality-estranged naive ones stoke the corresponding embers long enough until they become a blazing fire and inextinguishable conflagration.
Thank you for your explanation, whereby now, that which is called reality-estranged naivety by you Playaran is certainly also clearly explained. Whereby, as I already have said, according to my knowledge, this form of naivety is unknown by terrestrial experts of medicine, psychology and psychiatry, and so forth.
That corresponds to correctness, because the corresponding experts, which they believe themselves to be, have never yet, since time immemorial, concerned themselves with this form of personality disorder, and indeed also not in the new time. That means that, in this regard, but also in regard to the entirety of the human psyche and its thousand-fold forms of illnesses, maladies, and disorders, and so forth, they still have very much to learn. And this is so because, up to the present time, in regard to the necessary cognitions and the necessary knowledge, they are so behind that they do not even know a third of the effective extent of all possible variations of that which exists and is possible in regard to human beings psychically getting very badly out of control of the good human nature, and in regard to psychical illnesses, suffering, and disorders, and so forth. Thereby also to be heeded is that, in this regard, as a consequence of the growth of the population, continuously new forms and variations of psychical disorders emerge and therefore expand their manifoldness.
Then it is clear why great unknowledge still prevails with the earthlings concerning this in the fields of medicine, psychology, and psychiatry. Because when I think that, regarding psychopathy alone, several thousand variations appear, then the unknowledge is also understandable. It is thereby only regrettable that the physicians, psychologists and psychiatrists and other experts, which they often only believe themselves to be, consider themselves to be great and clever and are of the view that they would know everything necessary amply up to the ne plus ultra. Consequently, they would have nothing more to learn about that.
Indeed we should. And if I can touch on one subject, I will say that I have surveyed your greenhouse and garden and also recorded everything for Quetzal. Everything, through the efforts of you and Silvano, is in very good condition and no longer exhibits any unworthiness, as it did just before, when all the greenhouse and garden management over the last few years was disastrous and no longer had anything to do with garden and greenhouse, but only with a wilderness chaos.
Thanks, that makes Silvano and me happy. Stranger walkers and several passive members have also said that everything is fine again, after having been horrified by the state of the garden over the last few years. Others who had seen the state of chaos in the greenhouse expressed their opinion in the same way.
This is not surprising.
Of course not, because everything went back to the way I used to do it together with Silvano. Although we had to loosen the soil with the rotary tiller again after many a year of lack of care, this was done within the normal range of about 8 to 10 centimeters so that the soil organisms were not killed. This is the opposite of what happens in many horticulture farms, and especially in agriculture, where deep tillers and plowshares are used and the soil is ripped up and plowed up in an unreasonable and destructive way, which causes the soil organisms to be scooped up and die. So I have also ordered that the soil of the garden and the greenhouse be worked again, as it was when I was still doing it myself, so that I now also work again with weeders, pendulum hose as well as with normal garden hose, etc., and thus also take sensible action against the weeds, which consequently serve again as natural fertilizer. In addition, the garden and greenhouse soil has been reworked, and the necessary natural organic fertilizer has also been incorporated, whereby I have tried to use EM or effective microorganisms.
Which is a good thing.
Yes, indeed it is. But something else. Time and again there are broadcasts on television concerning old incidents that have till this very day not been clarified and are mysterious or forfeited to conspiracy theories. Such broadcasts are very diverse and deal with all kinds of incidents and occurrences and are also repeatedly aired in a continuous way. This was lately also again the case with regard to Marilyn Monroe, who allegedly committed suicide on the night from the 4th to the 5th of August 1962. Ever since the death of the woman, it has repeatedly been said that she did not commit suicide, but was murdered, which has, however, to this day by certain persons deliberately been portrayed as a conspiracy theory, because the effective truth is not supposed to be truth. In that regard, I wonder why this happened and still happens today, because at that time Askett explained to me that the assertion about suicide was not true. For Marilyn Monroe did actually not kill herself, because in fact in truth she had been murdered, whereby the murderer was her longtime psychotherapist, whose name was Green or something like that. As Askett also said, this fact was however concealed for political reasons. Consequently, this man was not brought to justice. But the actual reason for it, that is to say the details behind the murder, which is today still portrayed as suicide, were unfortunately not commented on by Askett. It is also to be said that on the last TV show in this matter, which I have seen, the presumption was also expressed that it might have been a murder after all, and that this very Green or similar name could have committed it. This rhymes with what Askett explained to me already in 1962, and on what I want to ask you whether you too know something about it, maybe.
I can say a few things about this because there are exact records made by Askett, which I have of course studied, but only during a time later than the event occurrence. At that time, Askett clarified everything in a good way, because it was an event of a kind that moved the human beings of the earth globally. She was able to clearly establish that Marilyn Monroe did not commit suicide, but was murdered, namely by her psychiatrist and therapist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, whose actual birth name was Romeo Greenspoon. He put the women for years under strong medication by performing drug therapies with her and routinely administering her barbiturates and sedatives, which he obtained from an internist named Hyman Engelberg, who prescribed her many of the medications and which were in reality ordered by Greenson. These medications caused Marilyn Monroe to fall into a deep dependence on her medication, and Greenson too, and to become increasingly miserable in terms of health and psyche, and namely the more often she received and took the medications from Greenson, some of which were also forcibly entered into her. On the evening of the 4th of August 1962, she was forced to take a larger dose of a strong sleep aid, namely pentobarbital, after which she became unconscious. And in fact things happened in the way that Greenson, who was then summoned to Marilyn Monroe, after her reawakening, murdered her by an injection of the barbiturate chloral hydrate into the anus, as a result of which no injection wound could be found anywhere on the body. However, Greenson was not held accountable for the insidious murder, because his act was covered up, whereby he was protected by the Kennedy clan, that is to say by John Fitzgerald and Robert Kennedy, on whose order he committed the murder. The reason for the murder was that Marilyn Monroe had a long, deep and very intimate liaison with the two brothers John and Robert Kennedy, which she wanted to make known to the public as a result of hefty and serious disagreements with the Kennedy brothers. However, the two Kennedys wanted to and had to prevent this, so they made Greenson carry out the murder, and that the two were eventually also murdered, namely John Fitzgerald on the 22nd of November 1963 in Dallas, Texas, and Robert on the 6th of June 1968 in Los Angeles, California, led to a situation of ultimately them two could not be held accountable anymore, the same as Dr. Greenson, who died on the 24th of November 1979 in Los Angeles, whereby everything was shrugged off for the entire Kennedy clan. Since from then on there was no longer any danger that Greenson could have been persuaded to confess if the truth had unexpectedly been found out and the whole thing had been made public.
So that's how it was and still is. Well, another problem, for paleontology, seems to be the Sphinx in Egypt, which is again and again reported about, just as it has recently been again, whereby all sorts of guesses are made and impossible things are claimed about the creator of the Sphinx. On that, Quetzal told me, as you however also said already in the 1980s, that according to your records, Pharaoh Chephren, that is to say Chephren, was the builder, that is to say originator for the building of the Sphinx. Can you explain a little more about that?
Which is really like that. Chephren, that is to say Chefchufu or Chephren, is the Greek name for Chafre or Chefre, which means Chafre is big. He was the fourth pharaoh of the fourth dynasty in the Old Kingdom of Egypt. Pharaoh Chephren was the half-brother of his predecessor Rajadef and the half-brother of Kawab, and he was buried in Giza, as was his father Pharaoh Cheops, who was actually called Chufu. His reign lasted from 2567 to 2534 before Emmanuel, that is to say, before the Christian calendar. He was also the originator and responsible for the construction of the temple and 12 statues, which showed the hours of daytime by sunlight. In addition, he was also the originator and responsible for the construction of the second and second highest pyramid in Giza, as well as for numerous outstanding statues in the Sphinx's vicinity, some of which have been preserved to this day. With regard to the construction of the Giza Pyramids, however, it should be noted that the first pyramids were built around 73,300 years ago, but were later again demolished because they had deteriorated more and more due to the weather and the climatic influences. 10,800 years ago, they were then rebuilt, which was due to the initiative of a king, that is to say, Pharaoh Salak, who ordered the dismantling and modification of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Once again, the pyramids fell to decay, because the weather conditions and the depletion of the pyramidal material had become so rampant in the course of the next millennia that about 4,500 years ago, when Cheops and Chephren dealt with the construction of the new pyramids, a complete rebuilding was necessary. Everything had to be torn away, reassembled and thus rebuilt, whereby the large stone slabs were also carved out of the hard underground around the Sphinx and used to build the temple, the statues, and the pyramid. So new square stone blocks were cut and used to build the temple and the Chephren pyramid. The Cheops pyramid was, of course, created under the direction of Pharaoh Cheops, who had it completely rebuilt and remodeled. While 73,300 years ago, it was traced back to partially non-terrestrial builders. When non-terrestrials from the constellation of Orion were present in ancient Egypt, participated in the construction of the first pyramids, and set themselves up as gods. The Great Pyramid was together with the others already in the early days, and then also for the last recreation aligned on the Orion constellation. But the Sphinx, according to the guidelines of Chephren on the Leo constellation, 4,500 years ago. The pyramids and the Sphinx were built solely by human beings of the earth, whereas in the first construction 73,300 years ago, non-terrestrials were also involved, partly using telekinetic powers.
Yes, you already told me this in the 1980s, as well as that the actual Egyptians who built the pyramids 4,500 years ago were mostly free human beings and craftsmen, while only a small part of them had to work as slaves. The food for all the workers, who comprised a small army, was, so to speak, provided by a food city not far from the pyramid, as well as facilities with dormitories were given for the workers.
Yes, that had been so.
I would then like to talk about the four groups, and I am particularly interested in whether you have gained new insights in recent months regarding the non-terrestrial as well as the Earth of the Future group.
There are some new cognitions which I do not want to mention openly, but only in a discreet way, and which shall be meant for you alone.
Whatever you say.
Then I can say the following in this regard.
That is interesting. And then it remains so that you do not make contacts with the two groupings and that you remain unknown and not present for them.
That is right.
Then a question regarding what you once told me, namely that in the United States there is a grouping, that is to say a secret organization, that is very well concerned with the things about extraterrestrials and their flying apparatuses, etc., but which, in terms of its machinations, knowledge and experiences, is, however, shielding itself not only from the public, but also in relation to the U.S. President and the senior rulers, so that they are all left in unknowledgeness and not informed. Is that still the case today?
Yes, and this corresponds to an undisputable but extremely secret fact, whereby the responsible ones of this grouping are also anxious to deny and conceal their machinations, cognitions and experiences about non-terrestrials, the way these are given regarding non-terrestrial existences, activities, relations and incidents, etc. This grouping, that is to say secret organization, also poses a great danger to persons who make certain observations regarding so-called UFOs as well with regard to secret activities that originate from the grouping. Particularly when observing persons want to get to the bottom of the matter and thus create elucidation, they run the risk of getting caught up in the cogwheels of the secret organization and being gone after or even harmed, should it end with nothing but harming.
What do you mean by great danger? Must it be understood as danger to life and disappearing from the scene?
That corresponds to what I mean.
Aha! Then we are, as in the past, back with the dark-dressed ones who also followed Gilgamesha. You are certainly still able to remember that, don't you?
Of course.
What do you think of the fact that my predictions, which I have been making time and again since 1951 with regard to the upcoming refugee phenomena and the migration of folks, are now being fulfilled?
It was to be expected, because although you wrote to governments, newspapers, journals, radio stations, and organizations, and sent them your predictions, everything was ignored and no one ever cared about your warning and predictions. And this is also true of your warnings, which have been ignored and continue to be disregarded in relation to the catastrophically increasing overpopulation, which should already, from the 1950s onwards, have been drastically stopped. And the same also applies to the worldwide birth stop and the equally worldwide birth control, which you have proclaimed and which are unavoidable and still necessary, because the present and further on unstoppably increasing overpopulation mass, with all the resulting Ausartungen, two evils and destructions, calls into question the continued existence of the human being of the earth. Contrary to the fact that you should have been heard and the necessary measures should have been taken, you were only ridiculed and insulted as a do-gooder, just as your predictions were also abused to put meaningless and facts-twisting newspaper articles into the world. Now the time has come, however, for which you have predicted and announced the migration of folks and the streams of refugees. All government and all their responsible ones, as well as all folks and the individual human beings of the earth, have had more than half a century to prevent the entire refugee phenomena and the migration of folks that is now taking place if, instead of ridiculing you, insulting, and slandering you, your warnings and predictions had been listened to, and if the respective measures necessary for that had been taken and implemented. But now it is too late, because the course of all those things that you have foretold warningly for well over half a century can no longer be stopped, as a result of which all future things will take shape according to what you wrote again on the 21st of July, 2015, in your predicting summary environmental destruction as a result of the overpopulation. And that everything will come about as you put it, there is no doubt in my mind.
For the most part, these are just facts that we two discussed together.
That is right, but there are several things mentioned in the article that correspond to your probability calculations, which I can only confirm by my own calculations after having studied the article.
I didn't know that.
All the fact concerning migration of folks and refugee streams that you have written and disseminated in your warning and predictions since the 1950s would be valuable for incorporating them as excerpts in a special article, in which it shall be pointed out what I said earlier. By this I mean that you have all these years since 1951 been trying to make public the looming problem of the migration of folks and of the masses of refugees, with warnings and predictions, but that no one has listened to you, that you rather have only been ridiculed and insulted.
Do you mean that one should copy the relevant passages in the predictions and work them through and incorporate them into a corresponding article?
Yes, and not you shall do this work, but anyone else.
Then I will think about it and ask around who wants to write this article. In addition, I will also select the appropriate parts of the predictions and copy them.
Good. But now, my dear friend, I still want to discuss some important things with you, which should only be discussed between us. And further, I also want to talk to you briefly in a private way.
Of course, then so be it.